These days, I hear you start families with dating apps. You swipe a picture of someone's face, and if you both agree not to hate each other, you meet for drinks. Fascinating. Back then, I met Agnes when she elbowed me out of the way at a communal pot of barley stew. That was the entire courtship. Good evening, friends. It's Thomas again, the quiet voice from your medieval dreams. If you're new here and curious about how a humble servant like me survived castles, plague, and noble egos, feel free to journey back through our previous videos. Before we begin, take a moment to comment below. What time is it where you are? And where in this vast modern world are you joining me from tonight? And if you enjoy these slow, gentle strolls through history, please like, subscribe, and settle comfortably tonight. We're building a family, medieval style. When the plague finally retreated, dragging its grim shadow back into the corners of nightmares, the castle felt like an enormous, forgotten pantry, empty and slightly musty. You know, the kind of emptiness that makes you think you missed something important, like everyone else got the memo about leaving except you. The noble halls echoed louder, the kitchen fires crackled with less enthusiasm, and even the mice seemed confused by the surplus of crumbs and scarcity of feet. I found myself alive inexplicably, not because I was particularly strong or smart, just stubborn, and possibly too dull for the plague to bother with. There I was, Thomas, still awkwardly surviving, a servant whose main skill was not dying. What do you do after an apocalypse, medieval style? Well, first you sweep up the ashes, both literal and metaphorical. You fix the hinges, because even empty castles demand functioning doors, and you feed the pigs. Because pigs don't stop eating just because humanity decided to dramatically thin itself out. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, life crept back into routine. I rebuilt a sense of normalcy out of daily chores, each small task reassuring in its tedium. It wasn't glamorous, no shining armor, no fanfare, just increasingly less squeaky hinges and increasingly fatter pigs. Eventually, someone important, at least someone more important than me, noticed my relentless dedication to mundane tasks. Promoting me from general servant to slightly less general servant, this meant a bit more coin and a lot more work. But importantly, it meant I could finally afford the most basic luxury of all, leaving. With coins clinking reassuringly in my pocket, I began plotting an exit not heroic, not grand, just pragmatic. After all, this wasn't the kind of place you stayed if you hoped for much more than a clean sweep of ashes or pigs fed on schedule. So quietly hopeful, stubbornly optimistic, and perhaps naively confident, I planned my escape to somewhere else. After the plague cleared out, taking most of the castle with it, the place turned into the medieval equivalent of a discount store the day after a major sale. Sure, fewer nobles meant fewer tantrums over slightly over-toasted bread or stew. With too many carrots, imagine the horror. But fewer nobles also meant less drama, strangely. I missed the entertainment of aristocratic melt. Now my role in the castle evolved into something resembling permanence. Think job security. But without any of the perks. You see, the castle was attempting recovery. Just like any workplace short-staffed after layoffs, it was suddenly all hands on deck. You'd think fewer bosses would mean fewer orders, but no. Apparently, now I was qualified not just to sweep floors, but also to manage livestock, assist in the kitchen, and occasionally mediate disputes between confused pigs and equally confused chickens. Multitasking, medieval style. As the castle rattled along, trying desperately to look dignified with half-empty halls and mostly empty coffers, I started realizing something critical. Being useful didn't mean anyone actually valued you. It was more about convenience. I was still Thomas the servant, only now I was Thomas the servant who does everything poorly, but consistently. Gradually, I found myself drifting further from the ornate rooms and velvet drapes after all. What was the appeal of cleaning luxurious carpets when mud and manure were freely available elsewhere? My fantasies shifted from noble banquets to simpler, grittier dreams. A patch of land that didn't belong to someone who could forget your name. Fresh air that wasn't thick with the scent of roasted boar and misplaced entitlement and freedom. From titles, especially ones beginning with Thomas, the ... Maybe you've felt something similar in your modern life, trading in aspirations of grand promotions for smaller, simpler wins like fewer Zoom meetings or a day without passive-aggressive emails. Back then, my dreams were just as modest. All I wanted was a plot of earth, air to breathe that didn't smell suspiciously like nobles who bathed only annually, and the exhilarating prospect of being called simply Thomas. Because sometimes, the grandest dream is the simplest one. The dream of no longer being defined by someone else's whims, or, more accurately, by the state of their boots. With a handful of coins I'd scraped together over months of aching joints and squeaking hinges, bought a donkey named Edgar who seemed even less enthusiastic about our future than I did, and a cart that creaked warnings with every move. Departing was easier than I thought. No tearful farewells, no one pleading for me to stay. If I were honest, the pigs might have been mildly disappointed, but they weren't ones for sentimentality, except for her, the lady of the castle. My lady, though never truly mine. Our impossible love, if you could even call stolen glances and hesitant nods across shadowy hallways love, was quiet, forbidden, and utterly hopeless. Yet, on my last night, she appeared silently at the servants' corridor, her deep green cloak hiding secrets. Our last conversation was brief, soft, filled with words that remained unsaid, carried more by shared breaths and reluctant eyes than spoken aloud. "Be well, Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet loud enough to echo in my memories forever. I nodded, not daring to speak, fearing my voice would betray the trembling heart that had grown used to hiding behind dusty stone walls. The road beyond the castle gates was muddy, perilous, and uncertain, perfectly matched to my questionable optimism. Edgar trudged stoically, unimpressed by the open road ahead. I met travelers along the way, their faces etched with stories of plague-scorched towns, voices heavy with tales of loss and slow rebuilding. Each story reminded me how narrowly I'd escaped, and yet how much still remained to be discovered. Eventually, after days of mud-caked boots and whispered promises of rest, we reached Wishwood, a village caught between abandonment and rebirth, quiet enough to let an unnoticed servant start anew. It wasn't glamorous, but then again, neither was I. Wishwood was a peculiar little place. It was quiet, yes, but not in the eerie way of the castle after the plague. This quiet felt alive, like the deep breath a village takes before deciding whether to collapse or try again. Perhaps 30, maybe 40 people called it home, though no one seemed too sure. Children ran barefoot with the self-importance of royalty. Goats wandered as if they owned the lanes. And elderly women watched from windows with an expertise and disapproval I've never seen matched, coming from a castle of stone and silence. Where my footsteps were echoes and my name rarely spoken, the sound of chickens arguing with toddlers felt oddly grand. People here had names. Families. They waved when they passed each other, even if just with one finger while holding a basket or a particularly grumpy goose. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's bad habits by midweek. I took up residence in what I generously called a cottage. Realistically, it was a roof stapled to desperation, with a chimney that wept when it rained, and floorboards that sighed under the weight of every bad decision. But it was mine, sort of. The previous owner had been a tanner who'd vanished during the plague, and the only resistance to my moving in came from a family of mice and one very territorial crow. Fixing it up was not so much a restoration as a long, slow argument with gravity. The tools I had were few: a rusted hammer with more personality than metal, a hatchet that had seen better centuries, and a knife whose blade had all the subtlety of a spoon. Nails were bent, wood was scarce, and everything smelled faintly of damp regret. Still, day by day, I patched the holes, taught the door to shut with something resembling dignity, and convinced the chimney to puff more smoke out than in. Working the land was a lesson in humility. You learn quickly that the earth is not interested in your optimism. I had no plow, only a shovel shaped like betrayal and a hoe that seemed more decorative than functional. Still, I tilled, I planted, and I prayed not for abundance, but just for something green to show itself before winter. I bartered what I could labor for seed, Mending work for bread, stories for company. Gradually, faces turned from curiosity. 2 nods, then smiles. Then 1 or 2 conversations that didn't begin with suspicion. Becoming part of a community isn't loud. It's not announced. It sneaks up on you. One morning, someone leaves a loaf of bread by your door. Another day, a child hands you a wildflower unprompted. It's slow, like the sunrise in winter, but just as warm when it finally arrives. And so, between the creak of the roof and the soft churn of soil beneath stubborn feet, life began to reshape itself not in grand declarations, but in the quiet rhythm of doing and enduring. It wasn't a noble court, but it was honest. And 4. The first time in my life, I wasn't just a servant. I was Thomas. Just Thomas. And that, I thought, was a start. It was not love at first sight. In fact, I'm fairly certain she disliked me on principle. The principle being that I was standing in the middle of the muddy lane with a broken wheel and the blank expression of a man who had no idea how to fix it. Agnes, as I would later learn, had all the patience of a storm cloud and the practical charm of someone who's had. To survive more winters than she'd care to count, she was leading a goat with more attitude than obedience. And when she saw me, wrestling with the cart, she sighed the sigh of a woman who has already regretted getting involved but knows she's going to anyway. Your wheel's cracked, she said flatly. Yes, I gathered that. Did you also gather that the axles? Useless. And you've hit the rut so squarely it might qualify as a skill? I was hoping to pretend otherwise. She tied the goat to a fence post that looked every bit as disapproving as she did, and started inspecting the cart like she was about to perform minor surgery. And just like that, we were something. Not friends, not strangers. Maybe field acquaintances. Affection forged not through poetry or stargazing, but through shared labor, a mutual respect for sarcasm, and an unspoken agreement that emotions were best communicated via grunts and spare nails. We repaired the wheel. Together, mostly her instructing and me trying not to make it worse. I offered her stale bread in thanks, and she accepted it with a shrug that said, "This will do, but I'm judging you silently." We didn't talk about feelings. We talked about pigs, fences, and who had the worst blisters. A romance, dear listener. Wasn't in the air. It was mostly manure and smoke, but there was something steadier, sturdier forming. These days, people meet with profile pictures and filtered smiles. They judge compatibility based on favorite movies and how many mutual friends they have. We judged based on who could carry a water bucket without complaining and who remembered to shut the gate behind the sheep. Our love story didn't begin with fireworks. It began with a wheel, a goat, and the shared look of 2 people who understood that survival required allies, not fantasies. She began showing up, not always with reason, sometimes with tools, sometimes with gossip, sometimes just to argue with my fence and pretend it wasn't to check on me. I started leaving out bread on purpose fresh, if I had it. I fixed the bench by the door. One afternoon, after a particularly miserable attempt at building a chicken coop, she handed me a better hammer and said, "If you're going to make something fall over, at least let it fall with dignity." I laughed, and she smiled, not wide, not soft, but real. We still didn't talk about love. But one morning, she brought me a bag of seed, a generous amount. More than she needed, and that was it. That was everything. In 1347, this is how it happened. Not with violins and moonlit kisses, but with calloused hands, crooked fences, and someone who didn't leave when you were your most unlovable. A beginning not of passion, but of perseverance, and honestly, that's the best kind there is. It took weeks, maybe months, before I learned anything real about Agnes. She wasn't the sort to volunteer stories unless they involved something breaking, or someone doing something foolish, which, in fairness, gave her plenty to talk about. But one chilly afternoon, after we'd spent an hour dragging water buckets uphill and only slightly cursing each other's sense of direction, we sat in the patchy sun, and she started talking. Agnes had grown up in a house with more siblings than sense. 6 brothers, 3 sisters, and a mother who never smiled without a reason. They'd shared a single room and a kitchen the size of a goat stall, which, as it turns out, They also occasionally shared with an actual goat. She learned early how to cook over smoke, how to sew torn sleeves while the sleeve was still on, and how to win an argument with just a look. Her late husband, Peter, had been a thatcher. Quiet man, she said, decent at his trade, and even better at ignoring everything he didn't want to deal with. They'd been married only a year when the plague arrived, like a drunk uncle who doesn't knock. One cough, 2 days, and then she was alone. No children, no family nearby. Just her and the goat. Peter had died before they'd even had a chance to argue properly. I didn't cry, she said. Didn't see the point. Crying doesn't thatch roofs or feed chickens. She said it flatly, like she was describing a turnip harvest, but I could feel the grief folded deep into her words like a note tucked in a coat pocket. Forgotten, but always there. After that, our days became a bit more shared. We mended tools together, traded complaints about weather and soil, how roosters seemed to be the least intelligent animals assigned the earliest wake-up duties. She'd bring her goat around and pretend it needed walking. I'd pretend I needed help sharpening my axe. You wouldn't call it courting. There were no bouquets, no dances under the stars, but there was soup shared over a flickering hearth and help stacking firewood before the first frost. Once, she fixed the hem of my tunic without asking, just took it in her hands and started stitching while I mumbled something about fence posts. Another time, I caught her humming while she swept out my cottage. She stopped as soon as she noticed and muttered something about dust, and that was it. There wasn't a single moment, no dramatic confession or kiss in the rain. It was a slow unfolding, like winter turning to spring. You never see the exact moment the snow melts, only the green where it used to be. I wasn't sure if I was falling in love or just getting used to her face near mine. Maybe both. What I knew for certain was that she kept showing up. With seed or thread or advice I hadn't asked for but needed, I kept making excuses. To be near her? Because in a world that had burned and emptied itself, having one person who stayed, that was everything. So no, there was no romance in the way you might think of it today. No texts, no likes, no carefully orchestrated dinner plans. Just dirt under our nails, shared labor, and the steady comfort of someone who could insult your door hinges while handing you soup that it is what passed for. Intimacy in 1347, and believe MIT was enough. The first kiss came during a chimney fire. Yes, truly. Not a romantic fire. Mind you, an actual fire. One minute I was cursing the smoke that had suddenly decided to move indoors, waving a damp rag at it like I was negotiating with a ghost. And the next, she was beside me, batting at flames with a wet blanket and yelling at me to move my useless legs. When it was all out thanks to her and not me, we stood there, coughing and blinking in the soot, and then she kissed me. Not soft, not tender, more like a punctuation mark on a long, exhausting sentence, like she just needed to get it over with. Before the cottage caught fire again, we didn't talk about it afterward. We just shared the bed that night. No ceremony, no whispered confessions. It's just a shared blanket and an arm that somehow ended up around her shoulder and wasn't pushed away. It wasn't scandalous. But in a village like Weeshwood, everything. Was people noticed? Of course. Couldn't sneeze without someone 2 cottages down knowing about it. There were looks, nods, a few raised eyebrows. Mrs. Barrow, ooh, baked bread and judgment in equal measure, took to squinting at me longer than usual whenever I passed her gate.
Oh!
But no one said anything aloud. Not directly. Just enough sideways. Comments to let us know we were now in us. In truth, it wasn't the sort of village that had much time for gossip anymore. After the plague, after the funerals and the quiet, people were more concerned with who could lend a hand than who was warming whose bed. And besides, Agnes wasn't the kind of woman anyone wanted to offend twice. The cottage, by now, had started to feel like a home. The roof only leaked during proper storms. The fireplace no longer smoked unless provoked. We'd cleared a space. Near the window for drying herbs and hung bundles of thyme, sage, and something Agnes swore was medicinal but smelled suspiciously like swamp. There was a bench she'd convinced me to reinforce, which creaked in protest but held under our combined weight. The walls were patched with care, though they still shivered when the wind came down hard from the hills. There was a church near the edge of the village mall, worn with a crooked steeple that always looked like it was about to give up and sit down. Services were irregular, led by an old priest with fewer teeth than sermons, but people still went. It wasn't religion the way some nobles practiced it, full of guilt and gold. It was something quieter, steadier. Like planting in spring, even if you weren't sure the seeds would sprout, Agnes would go sometimes, not always. I'd stand outside more often than in. But there was comfort in the bells, and in the silence they left behind. Even faith, it seemed, had found a new rhythm in WICHWOOD, so we settled. It's not perfectly, not without smoke or sideways glances, but together, which after everything was more than I ever expected. It was Mrs. Barrow who finally did it, the woman who could curdle milk with a glance and gossip faster than a sneeze in church. One morning, as I walked past her gate with a basket of eggs, not stolen, bartered, "Thank you very much," she called, out with a voice that could etch stone. "So, Thomas, ... Are we playing husband, or just doing the dress rehearsals indefinitely?" The eggs nearly didn't make it. I mumbled something about chickens and weather, and escaped before she could weaponize her eyebrows any further, but her words lingered like damp smoke. Playing husband, was I. I chewed on that for a week. Agnes never pressed. She wasn't the type. But her silences were often louder than other people's speeches. And every time I watched her by the fire, mending something with that little crease between her eyebrows, I felt a knot form, 1 part fear, 2 parts certainty. Marriage. The word didn't scare me. What scared me was what it meant. Permanence. Declaring out loud what we'd quietly built with chores and soot and soup. I'd seen noble marriages, ranged like trades, sealed with land and livestock. Love wasn't required, just a title and a signature. In a feast that could feed 5 villages, followed by years of quiet loathing and separate rooms. But me? I could choose. Imagine that. No counsel, no dowry. It's just me and a woman who smelled like smoke and time and argued like it was foreplay. Modern. Weddings, though. How you lot do love a performance. Photos, rings, dances, choreographed within an inch of their dignity. Matching linens, Instagram hashtags. Back in my day, the performance came after the wedding, mostly involving surviving winter and not setting the roof on fire. I didn't need a ring. I needed to say it, loud to her, and hope she didn't laugh. So one night I burned the stew. Not on purpose. I was nervous and distracted and forgot to stir. She gave me a look and said, "Are you trying to poison me into proposing?" That was her way of saying she already knew. We didn't plan much. A word with the old priest. A nod to a neighbor who agreed to witness. Agnes found a ribbon blue, frayed, probably older than the cottage, and tied it around her braid like it meant something. I washed my tunic. Didn't help much, but it was symbolic. The wedding was short. It had to be. The priest's sneeze didn't like standing too long, and the goat wouldn't wait forever. We stood outside the little church, just before the crooked steeple, in front of a handful of villagers, pretending not to cry. Even Mrs. Barrow was there, sniffing like she'd been chopping onions, but we all knew better. The vows were simple. Promises of warmth, of shelter, of mended fences, and shared winters. I don't remember the exact words. I remember the light catching her face, remember her hand calloused, strong fitting in mine like it had always belonged there. And a moment I felt ... happy. Not the loud, overwhelming joy of songs and cheers. A quieter thing, like the world had stopped wobbling for a heartbeat. Like everything finally made sense. I was going to have a family. Not because I planned it, not because someone told me to, but because I'd found someone who stayed. And we'd decided to keep staying together. It was messy and odd and small, and it was perfect. There was a church near the edge of the village, small, worn with a crooked steeple that always looked like it was about to give up and sit down. Services were irregular, led by an old priest with fewer teeth than sermons, but people still went. What wasn't religion the way some nobles practiced it, full of guilt and gold? It was something quieter, steadier. Like planting in spring, even if you weren't sure the seeds would sprout, Agnes would go sometimes, not always. I'd stand outside more often than in. There was comfort in the bells, and in the silence they left behind. Even faith, it seemed, had found a new rhythm in WICHWOOD. So we settled, not perfectly, not without smoke or sideways glances, but together, which after everything was more than I ever expected. Time passed like rain soaking into earth, slow, steady, and eventually everywhere. The rhythm of married life settled in, not like a parade, but like a pebble finding the corner of your boot, constant, slightly irritating but oddly reassuring. The cottage grew quieter and louder all at once. Quieter in the sense that we had fewer questions about where we stood. Louder in the sense that two people living in tight quarters tend to develop strong opinions about the placement of firewood and how stew ought to be seasoned. We disagreed on spoons. We agreed on everything else. I started fixing things without being asked. She started leaving half her work unfinished, trusting I'd pick it up. The cottage no longer looked like a squat for goats and regret. We had shelves. Actual shelves. She made curtains from an old cloak. I patched the gaps in the door so thoroughly you could sleep through a storm, which she did. Often once she started napping mid-afternoon. One evening I found her sitting on the stool, peeling onions like they'd offended her, and when she looked up her eyes were watery but not from the onions. "I think I'm pregnant," she said, as if announcing she'd mislaid a shoe. I said, "Are you sure?" "Because I'm clever like that." She nodded, and I sat down slowly, like my knees had been suddenly demoted. I wasn't against the idea, not at all. I just hadn't considered it, me, a father, me who barely kept his socks dry, and had only just convinced the chimney not to sulk during cold spells, right? I said. She nodded again, and that was it. Nothing more dramatic. No swooning or declarations. She went back to peeling onions, and I sat beside her, offering to chop them just so she'd stop glaring. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling and counting the holes I still hadn't patched. Somehow, the idea of a baby made them all seem more urgent. Wishwood, of course, went on being wishwood. Crops grew stubbornly. The church kept leaning. Bandits occasionally wandered through like they were lost on the way to somewhere more exciting. We heard talk of lords rebuilding armies, of tax collectors sharpening quills, of distant cities where people bathed in tubs not shared with livestock. But mostly, we had our days we planted. We mended. We argued about porridge. And now there was a third chair by the hearth, waiting for someone smaller and louder to take it. I had no idea what kind of father I'd be. But then again, I'd had no idea what kind of husband I'd be, either, and Agnes hadn't left yet. So I figured I might just survive fatherhood too. Part 7. The family years' time passed like rain soaking into earth, slow, steady, and eventually everywhere. The rhythm of married life settled in, not like a parade, but like a pebble finding the corner of your boot, constant. Quieter in the sense that we had fewer questions about where we stood, tend to develop strong opinions about the placement of firewood and how stew ought to be seasoned. We disagreed on spoons. We agreed on everything else. I started fixing things without being asked. She started leaving half her work unfinished, trusting I'd pick it up. The cottage no longer looked like a squat for goats and regret. We had shelves. Actual shelves. She made curtains from an old cloak. I patched the gaps in the door so thoroughly you could sleep through a storm, which she did. Often once she started napping mid-afternoon. One evening I found her sitting on the stool, peeling onions like they'd offended her, and when she looked up her eyes were watery but not from the onions. "I think I'm pregnant," she said, as if announcing she'd mislaid a shoe. I said, "Are you sure?" "Because I'm clever like that." She nodded, and I sat down slowly, like my knees had been suddenly demoted. I wasn't against the idea, not at all. I just hadn't considered it, me, a father, me who barely kept his socks dry, and had only just convinced the chimney not to sulk during cold spells, right? I said. She nodded again, and that was it. Nothing more dramatic. no swooning or declarations. She went back to peeling onions, and I sat beside her, offering to chop them just so she'd stop glaring. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling and counting the holes I still hadn't patched. Somehow, the idea of a baby made them all seem more urgent. Wishwood, of course, went on being wishwood. Crops grew stubbornly. The church kept leaning. Bandits occasionally wandered through like they were lost on the way to somewhere more exciting. We heard talk of lords rebuilding armies, of tax collectors sharpening quills, of distant cities where people bathed in tubs not shared with livestock. But mostly, we had our days we planted, we mended, we argued about porridge. And now, there was a third chair by the hearth, waiting for someone smaller and louder to take it. I had no idea what kind of father I'd be. But then again, I'd had no idea what kind of husband I'd be, either, and Agnes hadn't left yet. So I figured I might just survive fatherhood too. There was a church near the edge of the village, small, worn with a crooked steeple that always looked like it was about to give up and sit down. It wasn't religion the way some nobles practiced it, full of guilt and gold. It was something quieter, steadier, like planting in spring even if you weren't sure the seeds would sprout. Agnes would go sometimes, not always. I'd stand outside more often than in, but there was comfort in the bells and in the silence they left behind. Even Faith, it seemed, had found a new rhythm in WYCHWOOD. So we settled. Not perfectly, not without smoke or sideways glances, but together, which after everything was more than I ever expected. And yes, if you're wondering, I'll tell you all about what happened next, about the crying and the diapers and the whole mess of trying to raise a child in a world that still didn't know whether it was ending or beginning again. In fact, I'll tell you the whole story, because one child turned into 3. Don't ask me how. It's not that kind of story. But for now, that part can wait. Tonight, I'm sitting here, fire crackling low, listening to the wind sneak through. The window cracks I still haven't sealed properly. Agnes is asleep or pretending to be. I'm thinking back to the castle, to the stone floors, the heavy doors, the silences that rang louder than laughter. I was a servant, a shadow, a man no one looked at twice. A certainty, even in my smallness. There was a strange kind of dignity in that life. I didn't matter much, no, but I was part of something larger. There were whispers in corners, parchments passed hand to hand, quiet meetings after dusk where I understood not the words, but the weight they carried. Decisions that shaped borders, murmurs of kings and councils and wars that would soon be writ large in the annals of someone else's history. I didn't know exactly what they meant, but I felt it. The gravity of being close to where the threads of the kingdom were pulled. Even as a nobody, I had a front row seat to something monumental. And her, she lingers in my thoughts more than I'd like to admit. Her voice, her smile that never quite reached her eyes when the others were watching. I wonder what became of her. She's still glancing over her shoulder. If she ever misses the boy who once served her wine and dared to care. She belonged to a world I could never enter. But she gave me a glimpse, and sometimes that feels like both a gift and a wound. And then I remember this roof, this fire, this soft snore beside me, and I realized the freedom I fought so quietly for came with mud on my boots, frost on my sleeves, and a weight in my arms I never expected, the weight of a life that was mine. That's how. I started a family in 1347. No perfect photos, no matching. Linens, just a roof that didn't leak, and someone to share the fire with. Good night.